Welcome to the Midnight Archive. Some stories are never gone. They are only waiting to be opened. Long before stone houses and written names, a small tribe returned each spring to a bright valley between two ridges. Morning mist rested over the grass, and a clear river carried the first gold of sunrise. The people called it the Valley of the First Echo, because at dawn, before any human voice was heard, the land sometimes answered with a sound older than memory. Aura often woke before the others. She would walk down to the river with a leather pouch for roots and herbs, watching how the valley changed before the tribe opened its eyes. She was not the strongest hunter, nor the loudest voice by the fire, but she noticed small things: a bent blade of grass, a sudden silence among birds, a track where no track should be. Then the valley gave its first sound of the morning. It came from the distant stones, soft and hollow, like breath passing through an empty bone. Era did not answer. The old rule was clear: if the echo called first, no human voice should follow. So she stood still by the river, listening as the golden light touched the grass. Behind Era, small bare feet pressed into the wet grass. Tar had followed her from the sleeping camp, wrapped in a little hide cloak. He was only 7 winters old, curious enough to fear almost nothing. He looked toward the distant stones, listening to the same hollow sound, and for a moment the valley seemed to hold both of them in silence. The sound came again, low and hollow, drifting across the valley like wind through stone. This time, it seemed to carry something softer inside it, almost like the cry of a child far away. Ara felt Tar grow still beside her. Without speaking, she reached for him and guided him back toward the camp, while the first sunlight spread over the river and the distant stones. The camp woke fully with the sun. Fires were fed, tools were mended, and voices slowly filled the valley. Yet Era moved through the morning as if part of her had stayed by the river. She gathered roots, carried water, and watched the others, but the hollow sound from the stones remained in her mind, quiet and unsettled, like a thought the valley refused to release. By midday, old Narrow had noticed the worry in Era's face. He was the oldest voice in the tribe, thin as a dry branch, with pale hair and eyes like ash. He had listened to the valley longer than anyone alive. Without asking many questions, he understood what troubled her. The first echo had called at dawn, and the child had heard it too. Narrow did not speak of spirits or monsters. He spoke of memory. Long before their tribe came to the valley, others had lived beneath these ridges and listened to the land more closely than anyone did now. Some places, he believed, remembered more than footsteps. They remembered fear, longing, and the voices of those who were never found. The next morning, Tar was gone. At first, the camp did not understand the silence around his empty place by the fire. Children often wandered to the river or chased lizards through the grass, but Ara found his small bare footprints in the dew. They led away from the sleeping shelters, across the open valley, toward the circle of standing stones. Era showed the tracks to Naro, and the old man's face grew still. The marks were small, almost hidden in the wet grass, but their direction was clear. They crossed the open valley toward the stones. No one called Tyle's name. Naro lifted one hand, and the search began in silence, because the valley already knew the child's voice. The searchers reached the standing stones as the morning widened. The stones were taller than any person, grey with moss and old scratches, arranged not for the eye, but for sound. Tyre's small tracks entered the circle. None came out. Ira knelt in the grass, feeling the silence press gently around her, while Naro watched the stones as if they were listening back. In the center of the circle, Errol saw something pale beneath the grass. At first it looked like a broken animal bone, but it was too smooth, too carefully shaped. She lifted a small flute made from hollow bone. 3 holes marked its side, and tiny carvings ran along it, waves, a sun, and little footprints. Naro's breath caught when he saw it. A light wind moved through the stones. The flute trembled in Era's hand and gave a single fragile note, as if breath had passed through it by itself. Then, from the far slope beyond the circle, a child's voice seemed to answer. It sounded like tar, but thinner, carried by stone and morning air. No one moved. Even the grass seemed to listen. Naro understood the danger before anyone else. The voice beyond the stones might not be Tar himself, but the valley returning what it had taken from him: his fear, his curiosity, his wish to be found. Era held the flute carefully, feeling its pale bone warm in her hand. If Tar was still alive, the valley had not hidden him completely. By midday, Naro brought Era back to the camp. From the shade of the shelters, the elders carried out a flat stone found years before beneath the eastern ridge. On its dark surface were 3 simple signs: a sun, a winding river, and a small human shape between them. Ara laid the bone flute beside it, and for the first time the old markings seemed less like symbols and more like instructions. The elders had forgotten the song, but the stone had not. Naro traced the 3 marks with one careful finger: sun, river, and the small shape of a person between them. The flute was not meant for words. It was meant for 3 notes at first light, where the river caught the sun before any other place in the valley. That night, the camp grew quiet around Tar's empty place by the fire. Era did not sleep. She held the bone flute in both hands and felt its strange warmth against her skin. Tomorrow, before the tribe spoke, before the valley filled with ordinary sound, she would stand where the river first caught the sun and try to answer without words. Before dawn, Era left the sleeping camp and walked alone to the river. The sky was pale, and the valley held its breath. She found the flat stone where the first sunlight touched the water before anywhere else. There, with the bone flute in her hands, she waited for the world to become quiet enough to hear the way back. As the first gold touched the river, the echo came before Era could play. It did not sound like Tar. It sounded like someone she had lost long ago, soft and familiar enough to break her heart. For one breath, Era almost answered with a word. Then she remembered Naro's warning. She closed her mouth, lifted the flute, and let silence choose the first note. The first note came out weak and uneven. The valley did not answer at once. Era breathed slowly and played again, lower this time, letting the sound move across the water. The third note was clear and small, almost too gentle to matter. Then the river changed. A thin ripple crossed its surface, moving not with the current, but toward the eastern stones. The ripple became a path. It moved ahead of Era along the river, thin and silver beneath the gold of morning. She followed without calling Tar's name. Sometimes the water guided her. Sometimes the grass leaned one way, or birds lifted from a hidden bend. The valley was not silent anymore. It was showing her where to walk. The river led Era to the eastern rocks, where the valley narrowed into a passage she had never truly seen before. Morning light slipped between the stone walls in long pale bands. On both sides, ancient markings covered the rock, hands, animals, and circles of sun. Holding the flute at her side, Era stepped into the hidden way and followed the path deeper inside. The narrow passage opened into a hidden meadow, filled with morning light. At its center stood an old low tree, its roots wrapped around stones like careful hands. Beneath it sat Tar. He was alive, but still as carved wood, his eyes open and distant. Era stopped before she ran to him. Something in the quiet warned her that he had not fully returned. Around the old tree, the grass held traces of a people long gone. Pale bones rested half-hidden between roots. Small beads, broken stone blades, and pieces of old flutes lay among the moss. Ira understood that this was not a place of monsters. It was a place of waiting. Tar sat beneath the tree, listening to voices that had been lost before her tribe had names. Tar's eyes slowly found Era, but his voice sounded far away. He had followed a crying child, not a monster. A boy who had lost his people before Era's tribe had ever entered the valley. Beneath the roots among beads and broken flutes, the old sorrow had waited for someone young enough to hear it and kind enough to follow. Car pointed to the roots, where moss had grown over stones and time had softened every edge. There, beside a small bead and the broken end of an old flute, I saw what the valley had kept hidden. A child had once waited here and never gone home. The echo had not been a trap. It was the last wish of someone who still wanted to be found. Era felt the truth settle gently inside her. The valley had not called Tar out of cruelty. It had repeated an old sorrow for so long that the sound had become part of the land. The lost child had not wanted to take anyone. He had wanted someone to know he had been here. Beside Era, Tar's eyes slowly cleared, as if he were finding his own way back. Ira understood that finding Tar was only part of what the valley had asked. Another child had waited here for longer than memory, his last wish caught between roots, stones, and morning light. She lifted the bone flute again, not to call the living, but to answer the one who had been forgotten. Tar watched quietly as she prepared to play 3 notes for the lost. Ira raised the bone flute and played the first note for the child who had been lost. The second note followed softly, settling into the roots and the earth below. The third was clear and gentle, and when it faded, even the birds seemed to pause. Beneath the old tree, the valley listened, as if it had been waiting many lifetimes to hear that answer. When the last note faded, nothing dramatic happened. No stone cracked, no shadow rose from the roots. Only the air changed. It became lighter, as if the meadow had finally exhaled. Ara lowered the flute and listened. Tar sat beside her, breathing calmly now. Among the beads and broken wood, the old silence no longer felt like waiting. At last, Ira stood and held out her hand. Tar took it without fear. Together they left the old tree and crossed the hidden meadow toward the passage between the rocks. Behind them, the beads and broken flutes rested quietly in the roots. The place no longer felt like it was calling. It felt like it had finally been heard. The passage between the rocks no longer felt hidden from the world. Sunlight reached its walls, touching the old handprints and animal marks with quiet gold. Tar walked beside Era without drifting away. He looked tired, but his steps were his own. In Era's hand, the bone flute was silent now, warm from the notes it had carried. When Era and Tar stepped out of the passage, the open valley seemed wider than before. Smoke rose from the campfires in soft morning lines, and the first people saw them from the grass. No one shouted at first. The tribe only stood still, as if afraid to break the moment. Then someone began to run, and the valley filled with human voices again. And the first woman to reach Tar fell to her knees before him and touched his face with trembling hands. Only then did the others begin to breathe again. Era stood a little apart, holding the silent flute. No one asked where the child had been. For that moment, it was enough that his feet stood in the grass and his eyes belonged to the living. Narrow came to Era only after Tar was surrounded by living hands and familiar voices. He looked at the bone flute resting in her palm, then at the child laughing weakly among his people. The old man did not call the flute powerful. He called it remembered. Some things, he said, do not belong to those who find them. They belong to those who are willing to listen. Naro held the flute with both hands, careful as if it was still listening. Ara sat beside him and watched the camp return to itself. Tar was held, fed, and warmed by familiar voices. The valley had not become ordinary, but it had become kind again. What had been lost was not erased. It was simply no longer alone. Before the sun began to fall, Nara placed the flute on a small stone at the edge of the camp. Era stood beside him, understanding without being told. The flute would not be worn, traded, or hidden. It would remain where voices could reach it, not as a warning, but as a promise. The valley would be listened to, and no child would be forgotten again. Near the stone, Narrow placed 3 small pebbles beside the flute, one for the child who returned, one for the child who had waited, and one for every voice the valley might carry after them. Era did not speak. She only watched the sunlight touch the pale bone, and understood that remembering was sometimes the gentlest way to let go. By evening, the camp sounded like itself again. Children ran between the shelters, careful at first, then laughing as they had before. Tar sat close to his family, eating slowly, his small smile returning one breath at a time. Era watched from the edge of the firelight. Behind her, on the memory stone, the flute rested in silence. Era stayed at the edge of the camp until the sun touched the hills. The valley no longer felt empty between its sounds. It held laughter, smoke, footsteps, and one silence that had finally been answered. She looked back at the memory stone, then at the fires of her people, and knew the archive of the valley would not close again. That night, the valley did not whisper with hunger or grief. It carried softer things, a child's laugh, the crackle of fires, the low voices of people telling the day back to one another. Ira understood then that every place remembers. Some memories become warnings, some become songs, and some wait, quietly, for someone kind enough to listen. Under the bright moon, Era left the flute where the valley could keep it. Below her the fires burned softly, and Tar's laughter rose among the voices of his people. The old sorrow had not vanished, but it had changed. It was no longer a cry in the dark. It had become a song the valley would carry, gently, for anyone willing to listen. Long after Era returned to the fires, the flute remained beneath the moon. The valley held it gently, among stone, grass, and starlight. Below, the people slept, laughed softly, and dreamed without fear. And if the night carried a song through the hills, it was not a warning anymore. It was a memory, finally at peace. You have been listening to the Midnight Archive. Tonight's file is closed, but the valley keeps its song beneath the moon. Sleep well, and when the world grows quiet again, another forgotten story may open. This file is now closed, but the archive is never empty. Subscribe for the next Midnight File.